Chapter 12. Utter darkness all around, apart from a glow of light like a torch, spilling yellow to be swallowed up. A soft thumping sound grows nearer, and then a creature like a kangaroo bounds past, softly lit at the edge of the glow for a moment, and then gone, bouncing quietly. The corner of a school desk, the grain of the wood huge and deep. Someone's illegible initials and a patch of floor. A hand swims past, and then deeper. It was late one Saturday night when we drew up in the town. We'd loaded up Rafe's pickup with nothing more than a couple of bags and driven out here, leaving our lives behind. Bored, unhappy, two misfits who wanted something more, something different. We looked around us at the ghost town's deserted square and decided to call it home. I can still remember it very clearly. That night, that moment, the pickup pulled up against the curb and us standing 1 foot on the bumper, looking around and thinking, what the heck, let's have our own town. It was quiet and dark, just the sound of us dragging on cigarettes and the haze of the pickup's headlights. And I can remember realizing that this night was special, that you don't get many like it in your life. How often do you just get the hell up and do something? How often do you have the courage or the strength to leave everything behind and look for something new, to search for something that you can be happy with? To do that, to have taken the risk and to have discovered something, that felt very special. Later that night we found an old piano in one of the rooms off the square, and we wrote a melody, a sweet and singing song. We wrote the town. 10 years later, things were a little different. For a while it had been just us, hanging out in the disused buildings, trying to write our songs. We were going to be stars in those days. We were going to write tunes which people would weep to hear, which would turn hearts and heads and live forever in people's minds. We weren't just going to stay in the town forever. No way. It wasn't important in itself. It was just a symbol of our freedom. But then, slowly, other people began to drift into some of the houses. At first, they were a bit like us, loners looking for a place to rest while they recouped to rejoin the struggle which some people's lives are always going to be. They didn't join up with us as such. We didn't become some gang or commune. They just settled, and we'd see them around. And then we saw more and more. Today, there were a few hundred people living there. Couples, whole families. The place had become a town again, and Rafe and I were still there. We hadn't got away. We hadn't found what we were looking for and left. Somehow, we'd been sidetracked, and we were now the founding fathers of the new town which had risen from the ashes of the dead one we'd discovered. Things between Rafe and me had gone a little awry in the last couple of years. Somehow, something had gotten in the way of our friendship, and we'd moved a little bit apart. When we'd arrived on that dark and interesting night, our concerns, our hopes, and ourselves had been the same. We were two sides of the same coin. We were each other's oldest, best, and only friend. Somehow, things had changed, and our interests had diverged, as if the town itself had come between us. I hoped that today I might be able to do something about that. A big meeting was to be held in the square. Something was threatening the town, or was thought to be. I felt the issue had been blown out of proportion, and I couldn't get that excited about it. But as a founding father, I had quite a lot of respect amongst the people, and I knew I ought to be there. I turned up at the square quite early, and saw that 4 chairs had been set out at the front. I was aware that one of them was for me, that Rafe and I were to be joined by a couple of others to sit up there and oversee the debate, as if we were the government. I never really got my head around our supposed status in the town, and suddenly I knew what I should do. Instead of going and sitting in my chair, instead of taking my rightful place up there, I walked over to the curb, the very spot where we'd stopped the pickup all those years ago. Then I bent and I sat down on the warm stone. I knew that people would be wondering what I was up to, why I wasn't taking my place up there at the front, but it seemed like the right thing to do. When Rafe came into the square, he'd see me sitting down there, he'd remember that night, remember what we came for, and the way we were back then. And then he'd come and sit beside me and the years would disappear. We'd be two friends again, hunkered down on the curb, facing the world together and thinking, what the hell, it'll work out. Seeing us together like that, seeing the founders side by side once more would pull the town together and we could beat this issue, face it as one and overcome it. The square filled up quickly, and I looked around the gathering crowd, marvelling at how many people were here now, amazed at how a community had grown up from nothing and taken a life of its own. Then I looked back and saw that Rafe had arrived. He was sitting in one of the chairs. I stared at him, thinking that maybe he hadn't seen me when he came in. He was sitting with arms folded, impressive in a suit and tie, listening to the speeches. He looked across at me and frowned, indicating the chair beside him. I shook my head, smiling, thinking that he'd know what I meant, and he shrugged and turned back to the debate, watching with judicial weight and authority, like a founding father should do. I looked at him and realized that I'd blown it. I'd misunderstood everything. I thought that by a romantic gesture I could pull everything back to the way it used to be, but all I'd done was pass up what little authority and belonging I had. Rafe was a part of the community, a central person in this collection of people. I could have been, but I was losing it. Losing it because my heart was in the wrong place, because I was living in my own world on the periphery, in a world that was a film with me as the hero. The debate continued, but I couldn't hear it. My heart felt empty, as if I was falling like a stone, and my ears filled with a rushing sound, a dreadful fear and loneliness. I got up and walked away from the curb, away from the debate. A few heads turned curiously, but not many. Not enough. I went into the old bar where the wrecked piano still stood. On top of it lay a dusty cigarette packet, yellow with age. It was Rafe's from the night we arrived. We'd left it there as a monument back when we both thought the same way and believed the same gestures, and seeing it made me realize how long it was since I'd been in there. I stood in front of the piano and prepared for one last chance. Through the dusty, dirty window I could see the crowd out in the sunlight, still listening, still turning over the weight and confusion of the issue, trapped in today with the past forgotten. I reached out to the keys and did what I could. I played the melody, the tune Rafe and I had written the night we arrived. When that melody drifted across the square, I hoped desperately, then things would be all right. People would recognize it, Rafe would recognize it, and what I'd failed to do on the curb would happen. Everything would come together, pulled by a melody from the past, from the beginning of everything. Only when I started did I realize how long it had been since I'd last played, how I'd lost touch and forgotten. My fingers groped over the dusty keys, but didn't know where to go. I couldn't remember the tune. I scrambled, I faked, I tried to find the notes, but they weren't there anymore. The melody had gone. I looked up to see that a couple of people were looking across, including Rafe, but they just turned away, back towards the debate, towards their world. The world that they had, and I did not. The melody was dead. I couldn't remember the tune. I realized then what I was, how deeply I had failed. Rafe had changed, the world had changed, and yet I had stayed the same. I was still the same romantic, stupid boy who turned up 10 years ago with a head full of dreams and belief in his own special nature. I hadn't changed. Though I had some spurious standing here, I was still the same romantic loser deep inside. Rafe had moved on, had assumed the mantle and gone with it, become serious, an important person. I could see him out there, concentrating hard on the meeting, and I knew I should be doing the same. Not trying to solve everything with one melodramatic masterstroke. All I'd done was to remove myself from a spotlight I hadn't deserved in the first place, and suddenly I felt old and tired. Weighted down with wasted years. Until that moment, I hadn't thought anything had really changed, but I realized then that time had flowed by, that the town and Rafe had gone upwards and onwards and left me behind, still tied to the past, still full of my feelings and nothing else, still the person I had been 10 years ago. All that time, all those years had been worth nothing. I was still just a preserved boy, looking in at the present from the outside, an empty space that was obsessed with itself. I turned away from the piano and left by the other door, the one facing away from the square. I couldn't go back into town because I had no place in it anymore, and I had no other home to go back to. The only place that would ever feel like home was myself, however much I hated living there. There was no other door that would open. Although it was still daylight in the square, it was dark on the side that I left by. Dark, an evening just like the first night we came. I didn't bother to go back for any of my things. I just left, and I knew that I would never return. I followed a dark path that ran along the side of a mountain until it turned into a deserted supermarket car park, the pavement wet with recent rain. A faint wind sent newspapers shuffling along the walls and sailed leaves like boats across the black puddles. It was still night, and there was nothing in the car park except a broken guitar and a supermarket trolley. I'd started to walk on, but suddenly the trolley started to move, and I decided to follow it. The trolley moved slowly because one of the back wheels was broken and whirled around. I walked beside it, smelling rain and fallen leaves, and as I walked I began to feel a little better. The moon was above us, poking out intermittently between thick and stormy cloud, and the dark land was utterly silent except for the sound of my feet on the path and the occasional squeak from the trolley's limping wheel. Then we were in streets, a residential area from an old-fashioned neighbourhood. Ancient streetlights towered above us, shedding weak pools of green light on the mangled pavements. It was extravagant and intense, like a moodily lit movie set, but it was real, three-dimensional. We continued forward between banks of houses, where the windows were all dark and all the curtains drawn. There was nobody there. I tried the locks on a few of the old-fashioned wheel cars, but I couldn't open them, and the handles were cold. I wasn't surprised. I understood this place. The trolley cruised on in front, and I followed. We reached a dead end and came to a brick wall, grey and high. I tried to climb it, but there was nothing to get a hold on, and I just slithered back to the ground. When I turned, I saw that we were by a canal. The trolley set off down the path by the side of the water, and I walked behind, looking up at the old warehouses and hearing the soft lapping of the water against the sides. One building was a little frightening, a huge white old hulk that looked as if it had once been a hotel or strangely ornate factory, squatting massively beside the sluggish water. There was something unpleasant about it, but I couldn't work out what it was. Nothing happened as we passed by, so maybe it was just paranoia. The trolley slowed and stopped, and I saw that there was a playground by the canal. The swings and the roundabouts moved in the half-light as if people were on them, and a large metal rocking horse with a rather odd head swayed gently back and forth. A small sound was coming from somewhere in the playground. Leaving the trolley by the canal, I went to investigate. I walked carefully amongst the swings and roundabouts, through thick leaves and long grass. It was a small playground, and it wouldn't take me long to find whatever was making the noise. It was a sort of chittering sound, which was good, or not as bad as it could be anyway. Once I went to find out what was making a crying sound in a playground like this, and around the base of a tree I found a crop of evil babies. I've seen them since, and they're getting worse. I saw that on the other side, one of the swings was rocking back and forth as if someone had just climbed off. I walked slowly along the wall, peering under seesaws and roundabouts, and as I progressed, the sound got a little louder. I hoped it wasn't going to be anything bad. The stuff in the ghost town had been enough for the time being. Not frightening, but solidly depressing. I hadn't thought properly about Rafe in a long time, and I didn't want to now. There was a bench on that side, and a dark shape underneath. I went up to it carefully and crouched down to see what it was. It was Auckland. The actioneer was curled up tightly, and the sound that I'd heard was that of his teeth chattering violently. His clothes were wet, and his hands were clasped rigidly over his face, shutting everything out. The knuckles were white and glaring, and the muscles vibrating from the force of the grip. I reached out and touched him gently. He flinched and curled into an even smaller ball. "Auckland," I said quietly. "It's me. It's Stark." Very slowly, one of his hands began to move, like that of a child who is afraid to look in case the bad thing is still waiting for him. I guessed that he must have had a pretty tough time since we came in. You always do for some reason. It's a bit of a downer even for me. The hand moved just enough for one eye to peek out behind it. "Stark?" he said, very, very softly. "Yeah." I reached out my hand. "Come on, let's go." More cautiously than I would have believed possible, like an advertisement for a whole concept of caution, Auckland slowly came out from under the bench. As I helped him to his feet, he kept casting slow, searching looks around us, peering towards the corners of the playground. "Have they gone?" he whispered when he was finally upright. "Who?" "The babies." "Oh, shit. You saw them?" He nodded, rubbing his hand across his lip. "Have they gone?" "Yeah," I said. "They've gone. Listen." The park was silent apart from rustling leaves. "No crying." He listened, rubbing back and forth. I'd expected him not to look good here, but it was worse than I'd banked on. Large patches of his face had a vegetated green tinge, and in places it was a virulent shade of purple. Seeing the babies was a terrible thing to have happened to him straight off. He stopped rubbing his lip. "No crying," he said. I led him out of the park towards the canal. Unfortunately, the trolley was now spinning slowly round in a perfect circle, which was the last thing that Auckland needed at that time. He cringed up against me, whimpering. I made sure his eyes were covered, and I closed my own. When I reopened them, the trolley had disappeared. Auckland looked up and stared at the empty path. "How did you do that? Look, Stark, where the hell are we? What is going on? What is this? What the fuck are we?" "Come on," I said. Let's get out of here, and steady on with the language. It looked as if we were stuck with night for the time being, and also with the canal. It was quiet and fairly sane, so I was happy with that. I was even happier to find that I still had some cigarettes. Auckland trailed alongside me, still casting glances behind, and then he pointed in front of us. What's that? It was a gondola, actually, coming gracefully towards us down the canal, describing gradual arcing circles. There's no one in it. Oh my god, it's full of bugs. Ignore it, I said. It'll be behind us soon. Where are we going? Well, to a degree, we have to kind of wait and see. Suddenly, we were in a forest, on a gravel path wide enough for us to walk abreast. This looks promising. What's going on? He wailed. Huge trees stood in ranks on either side of us, massive branchless trunks that shot straight up to blend into the black sky. Auckland put his hands on his hips and stood facing me petulantly. Tell me, Stark. I carried on walking, and after a pause he followed. It's not a good idea to talk while you're on the move, I said truthfully. It's distracting, and we want to stay where we are for the time being. Are you hungry? The actioneer frowned. Yeah, I am, actually, he said, as if surprised that his body could be finding time for so mundane a sensation. Good. Concentrate on that for the time being. We walked for another 15 minutes along the forest path. Twice an owl hooted in the trees, but apart from that it was very quiet and peaceful. Hold on. I turned to see the actioneer bending down to tie up his shoelace. He straightened and stared at me tiredly, looking forlorn and damp. Are you okay? I said. Yes and no, as you would say. And then he twitched and peered into the dark behind me, frightened. What's that? I turned and looked. At first there was nothing to see, only a faint rustling sound. And then I made out a dim, pale shape coming towards us down the path. Don't make a sound, I whispered to Auckland. This is nothing to be afraid of. Stand close to me and be very quiet. He stepped quickly towards me and we waited. Within a minute the shape had taken on more definition. It was a young woman, aged about 20, dressed in a neat skirt and a white blouse. She walked slowly towards us down the path. Stark! Shh, I said. The woman glowed gently, a white light that encased her from head to foot, muting the colour of her clothes and skin. She was looking straight ahead, eyes focused on the middle distance. About 3 yards in front of us, she stopped. Auckland's arm gripped my arm tightly, but he didn't make a sound. The woman talked for a few moments, speaking as if to someone standing by her side, although no sound reached us. Then she laughed and carried on walking. She passed us and continued down the path into the darkness between the trees. Before Auckland could ask me anything, I started walking again, quickly, so that he had to concentrate on keeping up. A few minutes later the forest stopped, and we were on a high, dark hillside which shaded down into a wooded valley. I led the actioneer along the path, down the steep hillside. Pretty, he observed, surprising me. In fact, it was. In the darkness, the green of the steep hills bounding the narrow valley was a rich, dark emerald, and though it was cold and rain was hanging in the air, it felt safe, like some elvish kingdom. Yeah, I said. This is okay. At the bottom of the valley the path ran by a stream which gurgled quietly and reassuringly. It led into a small village. Although all the houses were dark, it wasn't like the area I'd passed through earlier. It wasn't about alienation, it was just quiet and old. "Right," I said cheerily. "Somewhere along here we may well find an inn, so look out for it." The village was very small, no more than 20 cottages long, and we were out the other side of it within a minute, and without seeing any lights. I was beginning to think that I'd made a mistake when I noticed that the last house on the right, which stood slightly apart from its neighbour, had a dim light glowing from one of the rear windows. "Ah, looks like it's not an inn, it's just a house," I said. "What is?" I motioned for him to be quiet and walked up to the house. "Just go with this, all right?" I said, and knocked on the heavy old oak door. There was a pause, long enough for Auckland to say my name once more, with a heavy, pendulous question mark after it, and then the door was flung wide open, spilling a yellow glow of warm light out onto the path. "Well, I never!" The speaker was a middle-aged woman, fat and jolly, rosy-cheeked and wholesome. "Don't just stand there. Come in, come in!" I shepherded Auckland, whose eyes were completely round with unarticulated confusion, in front of me. The woman bustled along ahead, leading us through a dim corridor to a room at the back where the welcoming light blazed. It turned out to be the kitchen, with a huge table in the middle and a few rough-hewn wooden chairs around it. In one of them was the woman's husband, a huge rustic bear of a man. He rose when we entered and grinned at us, rubbing his beard shyly. "Well, who's this, then?" he said in a voice that was gruff and rural, but welcoming. "Visitors!" exclaimed the wife. "Been out all evening by the look of you, eh?" "Yeah." "Nasty old night," observed the man sagely, coming over to shake our hands. His hand was huge and warm, the skin dry and comforting, like the memory of your father's hand. "Look at you," the woman said to Auckland, poking him in the stomach. "Soaking you are, and hungry too, I be bound." Auckland, surprised into a smile, nodded at her. "I am a little," he said. "Well, go on then. Sit yourselves down here while I make us up some tea. Come on, Henry, you go out and get some more logs for the fire." The man grinned at us, picked up a battered old hat off the back of his chair, and opened the back door. "Her wish is my command," he said, winking, before going out into the night and closing the door behind him. Auckland stared after him, his eyebrows fighting hard to climb off the top of his face. "There you go," said the woman, setting 2 enormous mugs of tea down in front of us. "Get those inside you while I find you something to eat. Go on now." I took a sip of the tea, which was wonderful, strong and sweetened with honey. Auckland drank too, and I could almost see the warmth stoking his body, fading the colours in his face until they were barely noticeable. I knew the balm would only be temporary, but it was good to see all the same. The woman busied herself around the enormous old iron stove, clanging utensils and singing loudly to herself as she happily set about rustling something up. I turned back to face Auckland, who was sitting looking at me with an expression which clearly said that he had no intention of uttering a single bloody word until I explained something. "Okay," I said, leaning on the table. "Where do you think you are?" "I have no idea. Not a clue. What happened?" "Well," he cradled the mug against his chest, savouring its warmth. "It was as you said. I heard you say something, and then suddenly it was cold, and I felt as if I was made of heavy water. And then I woke up, and it felt as if no time had passed, but I knew that it had. I was in that playground, and I couldn't see you anywhere. I was very frightened because everything started to move without anyone there, and then I heard the sound of crying, and I went to find out what it was, and..." He stopped, and put the mug back on the table, his hands trembling violently. "Bad break. Running into them," I said. "Stark, what were they?" I didn't answer because the woman came over to the table and set down plates in front of us. From nowhere had appeared a massive mixed grill affair. Sausages, thick rashers of bacon, eggs, fried bread, potatoes. Auckland stared at it. "My," I said to him, "you were hungry, weren't you?" The woman laughed and went back to the stove, still singing. Auckland dragged his eyes away from the food to watch her for a moment, and then leant across the table to whisper to me. "I know that song," he said. "I don't know where it's from, but I know it." I just nodded, setting about the huge pile of food in front of me. "You would," I said. "This is like your idea of a feast." "What?" Now, this is probably going to come as no surprise to you, especially if you're one of the smartasses who worked out there was no gang ahead of time and all that. But Auckland was still obviously behind the pace, so I had to make it clear. "Where we are, Auckland, is dreamland." He stopped chewing and stared at me. "Come again?" "This is dreamland." "Are you saying dreamland?" "No, dreamland. When you walk along that plain, if you can find it, sooner or later you come to a gate, and when you go through it, you come into here." "Ah, and it's like a dream, you mean?" "No, it is a dream. This is where you come to dream, where everyone comes to dream." "You mean we're asleep?" "No, we're not. You remember that woman in the forest, the glowing one? She was asleep. Somewhere in the world, she was lying in bed or sprawled on a sofa asleep. When she wakes up, if she remembers her dream, she'll remember a forest, a deep, dark forest with thick trunks, and she'll remember walking along that path and then whatever happened to her after that." "The canal?" No, not necessarily. It doesn't work like that. It depends what track she was on, what she was dreaming for." "Do we look like that to other people?" "No, because we're not asleep. We're awake." Auckland finished his plate of food just in time to have another placed in front of him. On it was a thick sandwich, a hunk of steaming, home-cooked ham between two wedges of fresh bread. Auckland's mouth dropped open. "I know what that's from," he said, pointing at his plate. "What?" "When I was young," he said, "I used to read books by a woman called Meg Finder. They were really old, belonged to my grandmother when she was a girl." He stopped, struck by a sudden revelation, and looked at the woman, who was busy again over at the stove. "That's where that tune's from. My grandmother used to sing that tune. Bloody hell!" "Go on." "Well, these books that had been passed down the family for generations were all about children who used to have adventures." He smiled sheepishly. I don't think my parents were very keen on them, actually. Not required reading for centre children, I'm sure you can imagine." "Oh, you mean not Janet and John push back the frontiers of management accounting?" "Exactly. Anyway, in these books, whenever there was a hiatus in the story, they'd somehow come upon an aunt or something who'd take them back to her cottage for high tea and..." He smiled, his eyes miles away. "There were scones and jam and tea and thick creamy milk. Stuff I'd never tasted." "More tea?" The woman stood next to us, red-faced and smiling from her work over the stove, proffering a huge iron teapot. We nodded gratefully, and she topped up our cups and plonked a jug of thick, creamy milk on the table for us to help ourselves to. Auckland looked at it as he continued. And one I particularly remember, a farmer's wife took them in and gave them ham sandwiches. Exactly like this one. He indicated the fast disappearing remains of his. Exactly like this. He said nothing for a while and then smiled painfully. I used to love those books. Lots of people did, I said. That's why it's like this. This is a rest break, a pause. It's the dreamland equivalent of Stuckies, a stop along the way. They're dotted all over, mainly in areas like this. You can turn up, you're welcomed and fed, and then you go on your way ready for your journey. In fact, if you want, you can come in, be fed, go out, knock at the door again, and come in and be fed again. The second time will be exactly like the first. They won't even recognize you. They won't know you've been there before. If we came back in again, the old man would be sitting in that chair and he'd stand up just the way he did, and everything would happen exactly again. He's been a long time, actually. Oh, he won't be coming back, I said. He's not necessary. He isn't part of what's going on. He was just a detail. Auckland shook his head, mopping up the last of his sandwich. What you find depends on what you need. That's why I asked if you were hungry, I added. If we'd been tired, it would have been a quick snack, and then we would have been shown to our pair of high old brass beds with thick mattresses and feather quilts. Stark, how do you know these things? I've been here before, I shrugged. He looked at me intently. A lot, I suspect. Yeah. Why is it called Dreamland and not Dreamland? Which would appear to at least have some sense behind it. It's a long story. Auckland considered for a moment. So, he said finally, I'm dreaming, and you're here with me. Hello, I said, exasperated. Is there anybody in there? We are not dreaming. We are awake. That's the whole fucking point. Language, scolded the woman genially, as she slapped some scones and jam down in front of Auckland and topped up our tea again. Sorry. That's the whole point of the plane, Auckland. For those who can find it, it's just the way into here when you're awake. If I wanted us to dream, I would have just let you fall asleep. But I couldn't, could I? Because when you sleep and when you dream, bad things happen to you, don't they? Auckland looked at me, eyes wide. Yeah, he said quietly. They do. And do you know why? He shook his head, and I told him. Because something's coming to get you. When Auckland was full to bursting point, we took our leave of the woman. She showed us to the front door, chattering all the way. As we stood outside, she pressed the small bundle on the auctioneer, and he thanked her with a shy graciousness that made her blush. That's the best food I've ever had in my life, he said with patient honesty. Oh, hush now, she said, obviously pleased. You two take care, you hear? There's monsters out there tonight. I know, I said. Well, just take care, she repeated, slowly closing the door. Lovely shirt, by the way. The valley we found ourselves in was different to the one we'd left. The same sort of thing, but different. We followed the path down the slope until we reached the bottom, and then walked beneath the towering sides. It was still night and dark. Something is coming to get you, I said, picking up where we'd left off. We have to find out what and stop it. Why? Because otherwise you're gonna die, I said simply. Auckland stopped walking. What are you talking about? The first time I saw you, in the hotel room in Stable, you were having a nightmare. On the roof, when you dozed off for a few moments, you had a nightmare. In my apartment, you had a nightmare. People get nightmares. He knew what I was talking about, but was too scared to admit it. Not like that. Not like the ones you're getting. And your skin, Auckland. Like Villig said, you can see it in your skin. You're getting ill. You can't see it, but you're looking even worse now. So far, it's just cosmetic, but it won't stop at that. Something's getting at you from within, and if it reaches you, you will die. Is this something to do with the centre? No. This is a thing the centre knows nothing about. It just happens sometimes. It's like a bug or a glitch. That was being economical with the truth in a big way, but this was neither the time nor the place for a history lesson. If I had my way, it would never be the time. So, why did you bring us in here? Because if this isn't sorted out, then you've got nowhere to go. There'll be no point me protecting you from the centre if something's screwing you up from the inside in the meantime, is there? No, I suppose not. How long have you been having nightmares? Not just the usual, this kind. Auckland considered. A couple of weeks? That was about the same time he found out about Diligence too, which was possibly, but not necessarily, interesting. Emotional trauma could have got the ball rolling, I supposed, but it didn't make much difference either way. One of the frustrating things about dealing with this kind of thing is that there are very few rules. Sometimes things mean something, sometimes they don't. It doesn't make much difference in the end. So, what can we do? Auckland prompted. I don't know. We have to wait and see. Wait and see. You should have that tattooed on your forehead. Auckland, that's the way it works. I was hired to find you and take you back to the centre. Simple, straightforward. And yet now, here I am, dicking about in here, trying to help you stay alive. The life of someone very important to me is at risk because of you. If you include mine, the lives of two people. Things happen, okay? The job changes. Life's like that. It's linear, and it twists and turns, and you just have to follow it to see what happens. There's no crosscuts, no helpful hints, no subtextual clues. Things just happen. All you can try and do is get the hell out of their way. Yeah, I know. Life is one great plan B. Wonderful. He turned away. Auckland, don't piss me off. So far, I'm on your side in this. Yeah, and a lot of help that's been. I've been shot at, almost blown up, and now I'm running from shadows in a place that doesn't even exist. Without me, you're fucked, I said, staring at him, and I left it there. He stared back at me, his anger fading because it hadn't really been anger in the first place, but fear. I know, he said eventually. I hate that. We started moving again, and after a while he apologized. I told him that he was a dream compared to a lot of people that I've had to deal with, and provided a few examples that in the end even made him laugh. It was the fact that the lady I'd carried through the swamp had soon after burnt down our hiding place by not properly stubbing out the cigarette I'd told her not to light in the first place that did it. The air cleared between us, and things were all right again. I didn't mind. I wasn't at all surprised that he had to blow off eventually. People always do. People always find it so frustrating that there's no structure they can see, that they just have to follow the river downstream and see what they find. They want to know the plot so that they can guess the end, because they're afraid of what it might be. I can understand that, even though I know it's not the way things work. I never know what the hell's going to happen next, but I can live with that. So, he said after a while, where are we going now? Ah, we're trying to find a jungle, I said. Ah, he appeared to realize the significance of that. Like the one I dreamed. Yep. Somewhere around there will be your stream, and around there will be where the action is. My stream? Everybody has a stream in Dreamland. It's where their dreams come from. Did you ever spend a long time, say 6 or 7 years, taking drugs 24 hours a day? He asked, yawning massively. The colours were back in his face, and he looked very tired, so I made a decision. Look, I said, this valley looks like it's going to go on forever. We've hit a set pattern, I think. Meaning it's going to stay like this way however long we carry on walking. The best thing for us to do is try and get some sleep. I waited for him to say something tiresome like, but we're already asleep. But he appeared to have got a grip on the situation. Is it safe? I think so. Wait and see, eh? He said, and smiled.